as somebody who has gone through not only the transition process, but also having gone through it at a very young age. I was only between the ages of 12 to 16 when I was going through all of it. And I my message is that children deserve to be loved the beautiful way that God had created them, and they deserve certainly to grow up with their bodies fully intact and with the ability to experience adulthood in its full capacity.
You're saying that comfort is so accessible here in the United States, and that comfort leads to an apathetic spirit.
Discipleship really is just making a choice to be a Christ follower and submitting your life every day to the call of God on your life.
Our mission is to disciple young leaders just like you, helping you become everything God has called you to be. We're here to have authentic conversations about the real topics that our generation wrestles with, whether it's how to share the gospel, what it means to be a true disciple, or how to navigate faith in today's world. Our goal is to equip you with the tools, knowledge, and wisdom you need to lead in your generation. Join us every other week as we learn to be next-gen leaders together.
Welcome to the 1630 Show. I'm your host, Abby Sexton. We are a discipleship ministry developing next-gen leaders just like you to grow and thrive in the calling God has placed on your life. We want you to understand your identity in the Lord, walk with you as you discover God's calling, and send you out on mission as the leader God calls you to be. Together, we can pray, vote, and engage to leave a lasting impact on our nation. Today, we are joined by Khloe Cole. Khloe is a nationally recognized advocate for protecting children from irreversible gender medical interventions. Born in 2004 in California, she began transitioning at 12 and underwent a double mastectomy at 15. By 17, she chose to detransition after realizing the lasting impact of those decisions. Khloe now speaks across the U.S., testifying before lawmakers and raising awareness about the risks of youth gender medicine. Her advocacy is deeply shaped by her personal experience and Christian faith, which she credits as key to her healing. Let's listen in on my conversation with Khloe Cole. Khloe, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yes. I'd love to start off just hearing more about your background. I'd love to hear more about your story. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with you. You're a huge voice in the detransitioning movement, and just would love to hear kind of your story, how that started. Why did you start struggling with that gender identity to begin with?
So I am a detransitioner, yes, and I speak on various cultural topics, but my subject of focus is the transgender issue, primarily the pediatric and the medical side of things. And I mainly derive this from my own personal experiences as somebody who has gone through not only the transition process, but also having gone through it at a very young age. I was only between the ages of 12 to 16 when I was going through all of it. And I my message is that children deserve to be loved the beautiful way that God had created them, and they deserve certainly to grow up with their bodies fully intact and with the ability to experience adulthood in its full capacity. But I also think that in general, there are a lot of different ways that transgender ideology has infected a lot of our institutions, particularly in our government, our school system, and obviously in the healthcare system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So what kind of led you personally when you started struggling with that? What kind of started that journey for you? What kind of happened in your life that made you start to question your identity?
When I was a little girl, the younger you go, the more stereotypically girly I was. I grew up with a lot of like fashion dolls, like Bratz dolls, Barbies, Monster High. Um, you name a random doll, and I probably had it, and I probably had a bunch of them. But I also tended to associate a little bit more with the boys around me, especially the older I got. I felt like I related a little bit more to my older brothers, the boys at school, and I just found them a lot more easy to socialize with. They were a lot more laid back. We had a shared sense of humor, and shared interests. And going through puberty, I found it especially it was very confusing to navigate socializing with other women with all the drama that would go on, and not really having any similar interests really. I i also had started puberty a little bit earlier. I was about like 8 or 9. I was still probably in fourth grade or so when I started to develop, and with that came just a lot of unwarranted attention, not only from my classmates and from other kids my age, being the first one in class who was going through that, but also sometimes even like adults would make comments on like these developing parts of my body, and it just made me want to like crawl out of my skin. It was so, I had so many conflicting feelings about it, because I was so excited to finally go into, I guess, womanhood and feel pretty, but I didn't really like that in some ways I was being treated like I was a fully grown adult. I also started to develop issues with my body image as well. Growing up in the age of social media, I had gotten my first phone probably about like 11 or 12 years old, for my 12th birthday, actually. And so the first place I went to was social media, because that's what everybody else my age was using. Everybody else had like an Instagram account, they had Snapchat, they had all these different apps. And I wanted to catch up with them, because a lot of my friends already had phones when they were barely, what, like in second, third grade. And I felt like I was kind of left out. But on social media, I would see a lot of like very content that was definitely not appropriate for a developing girl of that age to be exposed to. That often um, was, it bordered on the line of sexual, basically. And I would see a lot of these images of young women that were very, very airbrushed, very idealized, and it felt like there was a standard that I couldn't really match up to. And especially as a girl who was a little bit more boyish in some ways, I was a little bit more on the skinny side. I had a little bit more of an athletic build, but I also grew up in the generation of thick, curvy, bottom heavy, hourglass, and I was just so harsh on myself, looking at myself in the mirror and comparing myself to this ideal that I had of what I thought a woman was supposed to be. And I thought, how am I ever going to be happy if I don't match up to that? In a lot of ways, I just don't feel like the other women around me. I don't feel like I'm pretty. So what's the use of me
Mhm.
even being a girl? Why was I born this way? And I have to go through all these difficulties with puberty, with periods. Why couldn't I have just been like my older brothers? I would have been so much happier
Mm.
if I were just like them and my dad and the boys at school. They always seem to be having so much more fun, and like their lives are unburdened almost. And eventually those feelings became, maybe I am a young man. Maybe I was never supposed to be a little girl in the first place, and I actually am my mom and dad's son. And that was after I started being exposed to transgender content on these same social media apps, where I would see this sort of over sexualized content. And where it began with that was through, I guess, what you call fandoms, which were like communities that were based around different fan bases of different kinds of media, like comics that I liked, manga, anime, books that I read, musicians that I listened to. A lot of the other young people in these communities were also people who talked about LGBT subjects, and particularly transgenderism. Many of them were identifying as alternative gender labels. Many of them called themselves non-binary. Some of them were full-on transgender, and it was primarily other young women who, I would say, like between the ages of 12 to maybe like their mid-20s. And a lot of them, they would talk about, when they weren't talking about their interests, they would discuss some of their personal formative experiences growing up and their feelings of not really knowing who they were, having a bit of confusion around their identity, of growing up as a tomboy, and eventually deciding that they were young men. And these were people who I found out I really related to in all of those things. And it was not only the relatability that drew me towards this community, it also was, it was just such a novel thing. I had never heard about anything like this before, and it was so interesting
Mhm.
to learn about. And eventually I connected to myself and thought, well, this is who I'm supposed to be, and I finally understand who I am now.
Can you also talk about just kind of what was it like when you first started maybe going to doctors or counseling? I'm not sure exactly what that part of your story is like, but just with your family, how did that conversation go? And then when you actually started going and talking about, potentially medically starting that process, what was that like?
I wanted to hold off from telling my family about these feelings for a bit because I wasn't really sure how they would react. And within this community, there were a lot of stories about people um, having rough relationships with their family after coming out as either gay or transgender. And a lot of them would even talk about like being abused, being hit by their parents, being withheld like basic needs, or even kicked out of the house just for coming clean with their parents. And I knew that my mom and dad loved me and they would never do such a thing. But I also was just very afraid of how it just added this extra tension of like, how are they going to react? I didn't know. And I wanted to make myself more convincing first. I wanted to start looking and acting a little bit more like a young man and modeling myself after my older brothers or my dad, or my male classmates. And so I started going through, I suppose, what they call a social transition, meaning that, well, for me, I started to cut my hair shorter. I started to um, pack away my girls' clothing and secretly start to buy more masculine looking clothing, or clothing from the boys or men's section. And the first people who I guess I came out to would be some of my online friends, some of my closer friends from school, and eventually I told an older sibling of mine about it. And I just eased myself into this identity and this mentality of me being the opposite sex until, um, after about half a year, I had written a letter to my mom and dad, just detailing what these feelings were, the name that I wanted them to call me, and that I hoped that they would love me the same. And they very much did. But they also weren't exactly sure how they would respond to this. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, it's a lot for a parent to hear from your own kid that you feel so disassociated from yourself and so confused about who you are that you want to try and be something that you're not. And I think that, like, as a family, that can be a very painful thing to grapple with. And it certainly was for my mom and dad. And they wanted to give me space to sort of mature through these feelings while also maybe experimenting with my identity a little bit in these more age appropriate ways, through um, through my clothes, through the way that I presented myself, and through my behavior, and maybe even allowing me to choose a different name. But they never believed that I was transgender. They never believed that I was a boy. They knew that I was just going through some of the difficulties that come with being a young adolescent girl. But they also knew that there probably was something deeper under the surface, that there probably was some underlying psychiatric issue that I had that was causing these feelings for me. And so, um, I think very reasonably, they decided to send me to therapy and have me speak to, a psychological professional, because they didn't really know how they might be able to further help me, and they wanted to help as a family to get through this time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So then, were there any medical procedures that you went through as well, and what was it like going through that process?
Yeah, so before I get into that, I should probably detail what those appointments with these psychologists and what with these therapists initially looked like. And I feel like there just wasn't a whole lot of exploration into these feelings
Mm,
that I had. It was just accepted that
okay.
I was thinking of myself as a young man, that I had this discomfort with my body, and that I had this condition of gender dysphoria. But in these, because in the state of California, children at the age of 12 are considered to be emancipated when it comes to mental health care. I could have these appointments by myself,
Mhm.
and my mom and dad were not required or even allowed to be in them. And they had no access to my mental health records. They didn't know what was being discussed in these appointments. So eventually they had to actually ask, like, what is going on? Like, our daughter is going to therapy. We're trying to get her better, but we have no idea. We're not being empowered as her mom and dad because we're not being told about what is actually happening
Yeah.
in her life and in these appointments. And she's getting worse. Like, she's going into her 8th grade year. She has no friends. She cries. She cries because she feels like she's so uncomfortable with herself, and we want her to get better. So what is going on? And she's already talking about like going on hormones and stuff with us, but she's 12 going on 13. How could she even be thinking about doing such a thing when she's still very much a child and she's going through when she's her body and her mind are still developing? How how could we ever say yes to that?
Mm.
And what they were told by these doctors was that, well, she's not your daughter. She's your transgender son. And you're going to have to say yes to her and give her what she wants, even if you're not comfortable with it. Because, sure, she's young, but gender identity is an innate thing. Children already know who they are from a young age, and it's clear what she wants. But they brought up the suicides. They brought up the commonly used, I think 41% suicide statistic within the transgender community, to sway my mom and dad into thinking, into saying yes. Because how these doctors leverage that is that they'll be like, well, your child is probably at risk of taking their own life if you do not affirm them and if you do not give them the treatment that they want to. It doesn't matter how young they are. It's innate. It's not something that they can control, and this is the only treatment that they have.
Mm.
It was the only choice
Mm-hmm.
that they gave to my mom and dad. And when you're a mother or a father and you think that your child's life is on the line, that they have this incurable condition that there's only one treatment for, you'd be willing to put anything on
Right.
the line for them.
Yep. Yeah.
And so, even though my mom and dad had actually pushed back in our personal conversations against me having these treatments so young, um, and they never would have said yes to it otherwise in a million years, they felt like they were trapped into a corner that, I mean, they would do anything for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that included saying yes to these treatments.
Right.
Now, what those treatments consisted of for me was I began with puberty blockers at 13 years old, which is, um, I think there's several different drugs that they use as a puberty blocking mechanism, but the one that they used for me was these injections of a drug called Lupron every about 3 to 4 months. And Lupron is actually a drug that it's been previously used for other applications medically, such as treating late stage, usually reproductive related cancers like breast cancer or testicular cancer or prostate cancer. It's also been used for conditions like endometriosis, but it also is a chemical castration agent.
Mm.
But a lot of facilities have stopped using it um, in sex offender populations because of the detrimental effects of it on the body. It's been deemed too cruel for use in those offenders, and yet we're using it on perfectly healthy children who simply experience distress around the way that their body looks and often trauma associated with it. And it has not been approved by the FDA for that usage at all. I also was put on testosterone to masculinize my body after the blockers had removed my body of its hormone creating of after the blockers had stopped my body's production of its own sex hormones in my puberty. Um, and so over the years, I started to look and sound like more like a young man. Over the next few months, actually, it was a very powerful drug, very quickly acting, and I had pretty much immediate physical and emotional and behavioral changes. I also was, I had gone through surgery at this time. I had a double mastectomy to remove my breasts at 15 years old, and I hadn't even had a driver's license by this point, not even a permit. I didn't know how to drive. There were a lot of things that I couldn't do, and yet I was allowed to consent to this surgery that would affect me for life, every single one of these procedures. And it turned out that the surgery ended up being the turning point of my entire transition. There actually had been a few years going by where I thought that I was happy. I thought that I truly believed that I was a young man. And I went into my high school years being treated as a young boy. Everybody knew me as Leo. I was making new friends as a young man, and most of them, pretty much everybody, except for people who I had gone to elementary and middle school with, none of them knew.
Mm.
None of them knew that I actually was a young woman. So, I mean, there were a lot of exciting changes in my life, from the steroids, from being making new friends, and basically throwing my old life as a socially awkward little girl away. I could finally sort of create a new life for myself and forget about some of the trauma from before, the bullying, the feelings of isolation. And I adjusted fairly well until maybe I would say around the 2 year mark. I just really started to fall apart. I stopped paying attention in school. I started isolating again from everybody voluntarily. I started experimenting with different substances to self medicate because I was so disassociated from myself. And I was just crumbling under the weight of basically living a lie every day and having to grapple with some of the social difficulties as a young man. It can be a very lonely experience. And it was an unnatural role for me anyways because I wasn't actually a man. And I tried to run away from this fact, but every day I was reminded by my body of who I truly was. And it was rough to live that way.
Mm.
The surgery, though, was ultimately what woke me up to the lie that I was living. It was definitely not easy having to look down at the scars every day, having to take care of my post op body, the complications from going through the surgery, and also the emotional side of things. I was going on 16 years old. I was in my junior year, and COVID was also going on. So in California, we had like these really, we had these we had very strict rules on what we could or couldn't do. We had the lockdowns and everything up until I mean, stuff didn't really open up until about my senior year started. So I was very isolated by this point in time. I wasn't seeing my friends, and it was just incredibly lonesome for me. But it
Mm.
also gave me a lot of time to sort of reflect on the last few years of my life and everything that I was experiencing with the surgery. And I didn't really want to admit it to myself, but things weren't working anymore. I wasn't happy anymore. And there were a lot of things about being a young woman and about being feminine that I really miss. I missed wearing dresses. I missed wearing makeup. I missed having long hair and feeling pretty. And in the isolation of my room, I would secretly put on makeup from the drugstore or put on girl clothes that I bought from online. But I didn't want to show anybody that I looked this way because I thought, well, everybody thinks I'm a young man, and I am a young man, obviously, right? Oh, how embarrassing it would be to be seen this way. What would people at school call me? What would they think of me? What would all my friends and my family think of me? But the major breakthrough was it was less than a year after I had surgery, and I was taking a class that was focused on developmental psychology. And I learned a little bit about how children develop between birth and 18 years of age, and also the way that parenting plays a role in that. And one of the lessons in infant development focused a little bit more on breastfeeding. And I mean, just in general, the subject of family and children, it was something that I'd never really thought about before. I had this idea that maybe I'm not going to be able to have kids when I grow up, but there's all these different things I can do with reproductive technologies, right? Maybe I can have a surrogate. Maybe I can do IVF or something. But I didn't realize just how
Mm.
complicated all that stuff was, and how important just naturally having a child would be to me until I almost was an adult. And I was learning about these things for the very first time in a very detailed manner. And it just broke my heart to realize, wait, maybe I'm not going to be able to actually have children. Maybe I'm not even going to be able to conceive because I was put on these treatments so young, just pretty much just after I had started my menses. And when I started reading about breastfeeding and really thinking about it, and learning about just how integral that is to a child's emotional development, social development, their attachment with their mother, and even down to things like development of eye coordination.
Mm.
It was such a shock to me. It was so beautiful, but also horrifying that I had that ripped away from me at such a young age, and it broke my heart. I didn't know what to do with myself for a very long time. And there was about a 2 week period after that where I just completely dropped my studies. I stopped paying attention in school. I just laid in my bed all day and I couldn't handle it all. Until one day I said, I can't do this anymore. This has hurt me. This has only hurt me for the past few years of my life. I've had the rest of my childhood ripped away by this. And I don't know what life is going to look like going forward. All that I know is that I need to stop immediately.
Mm.
And so I detransitioned at 16 years old.
Praise God. Praise God. Um, yeah, so much of what you said. First of all, thank you just for being willing to share your story with us. It's so important that we know stories like this. And I know how important identity is. And I love to talk about that with young people because our young adult initiative really focuses on 16 to 30-year-olds. And just the younger you are, it's just there's such an identity attack on our generation. Obviously, you experienced a lot of that, both at school, with technology, all of those things. And so we have to be rooted in Christ. And that's what we try to encourage our young people first and foremost, is to really be rooted in that biblical truth. So I'm curious, just kind of since you have come out of that movement, what has your kind of take on your identity at this point, just in Christ? What does that look like for you?
Yes, I think that an identity in Christ, I think that is ultimately the only way that you can truly find who you are. But I think that starts very young.
Mm.
That starts with the family. That starts with having not only the foundation of religion with your own family, with your parents, um, and having that passed down to you, but also having a healthy family relationship, which is something that I feel like so much of our generation just truly
Mm.
lacks.
Mm-hmm.
They have, I mean, I personally had a very distant relationship with my own mother and father growing up, but I feel like that's actually a lot more common of an experience in our generation than we might want to admit.
Yeah.
Many of us grew up with parents who, for whatever reason, were not very close to them, who did not open up to them because they had their own sort of wounds having to do with the way that they were raised, or because they were busy, because they were preoccupied with work or other things in their lives, and that ended up taking precedence over their relationship with their children. Um, and having lacked both a close relationship with my mom and dad and feeling isolated from a lot of my family in general, having a huge gap in age with all of my siblings, I I felt lost. I didn't really. I was also, I was bullied at school, and with this isolation and not really being able to connect with other children throughout most of my formative years, I thought that I was a monster because I would act out. I had all these emotional issues, and I knew that I would behave very poorly because of it, but I couldn't quite understand why, or understand how to regulate myself emotionally because I was just a kid. But I thought that because I was always getting punished at school, because I was always being written up and going to the office and getting in trouble, that there was just something that was inherently wrong to me, which, um, I mean, obviously there wasn't. I was just a product of my circumstances at the time. But without also that foundation um, of morals and a greater understanding of how the world works, from a lack of religion, it really, it was very difficult for me to contend with.
Mm.
And it made it very difficult to appreciate the things that I did have, including the way that I was born, my birthright of being a young woman, my femininity. And I think that in the culture that we have now, there are a lot of very negative messaging. There's a lot of negative messaging around, um, what it means to be a woman or be a man, or the importance of our natural femininity or masculinity as men and women. And I had really fallen into that because I didn't have a biblical understanding of those
Mm.
things. So eventually the transition ended up becoming, um, not only an identity, but a reason for me to exist, and essentially my religion and something that informed the rest of my worldview. So when that all crumbled apart, when I detransitioned, I actually had fallen into a deeper hole for a little bit because I was really scrambling to figure out, what
Mm.
do I believe? Who am I? Um, how, what is life going to look like from here? What is my purpose going forward? And luckily, when I started to speak out publicly, people, some of the people who came to me most quickly were the Christians, who some of whom were already in my life, in my family, in my friend group, and those around me, but also people who I was encountering through, my advocacy work. There were a lot of churches, a lot of pastors, priests, and even just normal everyday Christian men and women who would reach out to me and not only share the gospel with me, but they also, I think more and more I learned through them what it truly means to love a person, because they not only essentially gave me a spiritual home through them, um, they not only showed their support for me, but they also, these people held me to a higher standard very, very strongly. They were not afraid to tell me the truth, even to be brutally honest, because what their love meant for me was that they wanted to see me get better. And they wanted to extend that same grace that Christ had given to them to me, to strengthen me.
Mm. That's so encouraging. I know that, I mean, as the body, that is our job, right? Is to walk with people. And we always talk about on here the importance of discipleship, that we need to be disciples, we need to make disciples, we need to spend time with other people, pour into them. And we overcomplicate it sometimes. It's just doing life with somebody, caring for somebody, loving them, but speaking the truth in love as well, not letting them, fall away from the things of the Lord, because that just leads to destruction. So I appreciate,
Absolutely. And
yeah,
I don't think it is loving to allow people to live in sin every day,
yeah,
and to maybe not encourage them, but just to allow them to go further and further into these cycles that bring them further away from God.
yeah, right, absolutely.
Even if you worry about how they might feel about the words that you say, um, or how they'll react, or how it might affect your relationship with them,
Mm.
I think the most loving thing that one can do for the people around them who are suffering is to tell them in a loving and compassionate manner that they're not going to be healthy. They're not going to be happy if they continue down a self-destructive path.
Mm. Right. Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about what you're up to now. What are you working on? Just the message that you're sharing with people. What's kind of going on right now for you?
So I have been speaking publicly for, I think, about 3 years now. I started speaking when I was 17, and I'm 20 now. And it started with legislation, and testifying in favor of bills that protect children and protect the rights of patients like me, while also testifying against harmful bills that further this medical abuse and strip parents and children of their rights. I also have expanded into speaking in churches as well and addressing different communities across the US, even going abroad. But I think my most favorite events are definitely those where I am addressing people my age in schools, in high schools, colleges, because I think that it's the younger generations that are having to interface with this issue the
Mhm,
most.
mhm.
Seeing this in our own families, our with our own family members, and with our classmates, with our peers, with our own friends, and having to be exposed to this in school, in the classroom, and on social media, and figure out like how we really go about this. I feel like within the educational realm, particularly in college campuses, there often is only really one side of the narrative that gets to have a voice, and that is those who are in favor of this destructive transgender ideology. I want to present the other side of things, not the destruction that this causes, not only to individuals, but also to families, to our institutions, and to empower other young people to be able to react to it and to take down this institutional virus, not only at their own schools, but eventually when they go into the workforce
Mhm.
as doctors, as psychologists, as lawyers, legislators, um, and people in all sorts of different professions where this ideology has been infected.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we have a young person who's like, I am really passionate about this issue, and I would love to get involved and make an impact in some way, how would you encourage them to kind of get started in that?
I mean, I think it looks different for everybody. And I feel like I am definitely sort of a unique case
Mhm.
in the way that my own career has shaped up. But I think my best general advice to give is put yourself out there. Don't be afraid to. Don't be afraid of the backlash. And don't be afraid to say yes, to speak up, to maybe challenge yourself to change when you see a major opportunity, um, not only to get a leg up, but also to help other people, and to pitch in when you may be needed.
Mhm.
Because if I had, I when I first started, I was a very ill socialized young woman, and I didn't really know how to interact with people. I had absolutely no aspirations of becoming a public speaker, and yet it happened
Mm,
because I decided I want to make a change.
mm.
I want to change the world for the better. And I'm going to trust in the process. I'm going to trust God and see where everything leads me.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. Well, any last thoughts for our young adults who are listening right now?
I think if we truly want to save our country and our culture from not only radical ideologies like transgenderism, but these other institutional viruses that are silencing us and disrupting public life in every way, we need to keep going. There has been a lot of progress that has been made culturally, legislatively, in the courts, um, over the last few years, but we need to see this until the very end. And this is not going to stop until we are no longer being lied to, until children are no longer being harmed in the name of gender affirming care, until families aren't being ripped away, ripped apart, until our institutions are not being flooded with this virus.
Mm,
And that's up to us. Every single one of us has a place, has a role, a voice in this battle. We can do it can start with things just as small as getting involved in the conversation, with talking with your classmates, with your peers, with your family, reaching out to those who may be struggling. Um, and chances are, maybe on your school campus, there might be groups that you can work with um, to affect change in the culture on your campus, to get involved in these discussions, um, and even to create events that focus and allow for more open dialogue on these issues. Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of political violence lately come out in public life, but particularly on college and in university campuses. And that's because these radical ideologues, the status quo has been unchallenged for years. And so to see people like us come out and speak in favor, not only on the other side of things, but also just about the truth of all of this, they take it as a massive threat. But if we want to prevent further violence, we have to continue the conversation. We must continue the conversation so that it's no longer stifled, until one side no longer feels that they have absolute power over this.
Well, Chloe, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story. I'm so grateful. I love what the Lord has done in your life, and I truly believe that Jesus redeemed stories. I know He's redeemed yours. He's redeeming stories of other young people who've gone through this same thing that you have, and so I'm just so grateful for Him and for you and for others like you. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for giving me your platform to share my story.
Thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss with Khloe Cole how we can protect children from the dangers of transgender ideology. And thank you for letting us be a part of your life as you become all that God has called you to be. Be sure to like, subscribe, download our episodes, share them with a friend. You can follow us on social media at CE_1630 to see what we're up to, and check out our website, ce1630.org, to learn more about our programs, including our Washington, D.C. trip, free classes, and more. 1630 is an initiative of Christians Engaged, a ministry of Family Policy Alliance Foundation. Please consider supporting the ministry at ce1630.org or christiansengaged.org. Your support empowers this work. We'll see you next time.